and welcome to this webinar, which is part of the Further Education Trust for Leadership series of webinars on the work it has funded. FETL's mission is to support and strengthen the leadership of thinking in the sector and to share that work with colleagues in the sector as a contribution to innovation and developing best practice. This webinar is an opportunity for you to hear more about those commissioned pieces of work and to join in the conversation with the authors. This webinar will last for an hour and we'll be taking questions from the audience as we go along, so please do send them in and we'll gather them up for the latter part of this session. My name is Mary Joyce. I consult to boards and senior teams in universities and colleges, and that's on their leadership and their governance practice. I've been an executive member and a non-executive member of boards in the education and health sector over the last 20 years, and I'm very happy to be here today discussing governance in this webinar. One of the ways in which FETL engages in thought leadership is through the publication of monographs. Monographs are short, forward-thinking treatments of subjects that are key to leadership thinking in the sector. They're written at the invitation of the Trust, and the aim is to influence the leadership inside and outside of the sector. And the title of the monograph, which is the subject of today's webinar, is Recognising Excellence in the Governance of Independent Training Providers. The author is Dr. Sue Pember. She is Director of Policy at HOLEX. She also works independently as a governance professional. She's a former civil servant with the Department of Education, having a long career working with ministers and colleagues there. She's also a former principal and she's Vice Chair of Bedfordshire University. So she is absolutely one of the best people to be involved in doing this piece of work. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Pember for discussion on this project and about this work. So Sue, what led you to be involved in undertaking this research project into governance?
Well, the Association of Employment and Learning Providers has been getting increasingly concerned about some of the bad press they've been getting on governance, the organisations that haven't been doing that well. So they approached me and they approached FETL at the same time to say, is there something we can do about this? And when I first looked into the topic, I realised there was very little written about governance in the independent private sector, and that's why I got engaged in the project.
And when I read the report, one of the things that struck me was that it's a very diverse sector. So how did you go about, if there's no code that providers are following, how did you go about doing this?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about a diverse sector, because on one hand you can have sole traders who have got a contract with the funding agency and they provide apprenticeships to individuals and to employers, and at the other end you've got FTSE 100, 200 companies, very large companies, and in the middle you've got everything from charities to private companies to limited companies, the whole range of providers. So when you look at what's in common, there's a couple of things in common for all of them. One, they've got to work to the funding agency. They all take national taxpayers' money. The second is that they want to do their best for their learners, apprenticeships or trainees. So there was some common ground there. But when we first started, we really needed to see what literature was out there, what was written already, what good practice was there, and we didn't find a lot.
And did you have a group that you worked with?
Yeah, the association ALP set up a steering committee made up of providers, either small, medium or large, and they steered the work, which was invaluable, really, absolutely invaluable to the sort of the content of the project, the way we went forward with it.
And is there anything significant about doing this piece of work now?
Yes, I think for them, for the provider base, they actually feel that some of the criticism hasn't been justified, and therefore they wanted to get on the front foot. And I think they need to be applauded. They really saw that there could be an issue. Was the issue as big as they thought it was? Probably not, because there's some fantastic governance out there. However, there was enough concern to say we really need to do something now.
And I was also thinking that there's a lot of public money that's coming into the sector now, and I'm wondering also whether that was a factor in...
Yeah, again, the apprenticeships, which is their main activity, is very much in the news. And therefore, they've lobbied for like 20 years about getting more funds for apprentices, and they've now got that. But when you get more money, you get more scrutiny. When you get more scrutiny, more things are highlighted. And one of the areas that they want to get right is governance.
So this is a good time to be doing this.
Absolutely.
And I know that you've produced a code of conduct as well, a code of good practice, good governance practice for the sector. We'll be talking about that a bit later. What would you say is distinctive and different about governance in this sector?
Well, the legal structure of these different organisations makes governance different. So they're not an exempt charity like a college. They're not part of a local authority structure like an adult community learning provider. So therefore, their legal structure, whether they're a sole trader or a limited company or a charity, puts them in a different place. And therefore, they've got different influences. So if you're a charity, there is a code drawn up by the charity sector itself to the way that you operate in integrity and accountability. If you are part of the private sector, then you've got what's called the UK Corporate Code that is part of your financial agreements, which you've got to follow. But for many of these companies, organisations, they're a hybrid. They take in public funds, but they're not a charity, they're actually a limited company. Therefore, neither of the practice that is there already quite works for them.
And there hasn't been a lot of support for developing governance in this sector either, has
No,
there?
it's quite invisible. It's really quite interesting that if you look at the college sector or even the university sector and the school sector, they've all got guides and handbooks and chairs get trained. But if you look at the independent training provider sector, there has been very little government interest in it. So in a way, this piece of work begins to address that vacuum.
And I know that as part of your research methodology, you chose to observe a number of boards in action. And that must have been fascinating. What really impressed you from those observations? What did you see in the way that they were conducting themselves as boards that really impressed you?
Well, with any bit of research, the research officer has a bias, right? So you have an assumption, they won't talk about learners, they won't talk about trainees, you won't talk about apprentices. It was the complete opposite. It was absolutely foremost in the board's mind that they had to do well by their apprentice. And if they didn't, they totally understood the reputational risks on that. So that was really quite exciting to watch and see. We chose to go and observe because Ofsted, when they do their inspection reports on all providers, they do talk a bit about governance, but not a lot. And therefore, we felt it really important to the integrity of the work that we went out, and myself and my colleague Harry Dennis went out to look and view what was actually happening.
And was there anything different in the way that those boards functioned that you were also observing and taking note of?
But again, if you go back to their legal status, the majority that we saw were limited companies. Therefore, they have shareholders. So the shareholder will have an interest and sit round the board. Also, they haven't got, if you look at the articles and instruments of governance of a college, it stipulates that, you must have an independent chair, you must have a student on the board, you must have a member of staff on the board. That type of description definition of what you should have on your board in an independent company is not there. So often there was duplication of roles, or even a bit of tension in there. So the major shareholder would also be the chief exec, or would also chair, or the chair would be independent, but you would have the major shareholders sitting around the table, which puts a different type of influence. That you have to work harder to get independent challenge. But the boards that we went and observed have managed that in different ways.
And it sounds like that must have been quite a difficult thing to do without a code of practice for the sector.
I think, but again, there's not that there's nothing there. So you've got the UK Corporate Code, which is really for mainly the FTSE 200, 250 companies, but with a caveat saying other limited companies should look at whether they should adopt this code or not. Independence now is coming out through everything. You cannot manage government funds really, without having somebody around the board who can challenge the chief exec about whether that money is well spent. And that's where the tension really exists. And the other area of tension is and difference is that a limited company is set up under British law to make a profit. People shouldn't shy away from that. You shouldn't be embarrassed because you make a profit, because in the public sector or in colleges, you're expected to make a surplus. You don't want to get in a deficit position, and you put that money back through. So in the limited companies that we observed, they were very, very careful to make sure everything was appropriate, and to do that test. If somebody looking in, would they think the public money was well spent? And at the back of everybody's minds, those sitting around the board, was the learner's experience. And a couple of the boards I observed, getting views of learners was really important to them, or looking at the detailed data about whether apprentices succeeded or not was very important to those boards.
And how did they do that, given that, as I understand it, they don't have a place for trainees on the board or staff, and that's something that differs in the college.
But they have different ways of doing that.
Yeah.
So they're probably very astute at using surveys, electronic surveys. They're very astute at getting feedback from their apprentices, their trainees, and they acknowledge the link from a satisfied client, a satisfied apprentice, to good reputation, to getting more apprentices, more employer interest. So they understand that sort of cyclical work that needs to happen there. But again, there are other challenges. They're using public funds. They have a set of public rules to work to, and therefore they've got to make sure that all the data that's behind there is there as well.
And given that it is a diverse sector, and you've already described some of the diversity in terms of the legal configurations of boards, what would you say are the most difficult challenges for governance in this sector?
Well, because to me it's at an early stage, there is still some clarity needed between governance and management. So even at the best boards that we saw, it quickly went from top level governance issues like, is this organisation fit for purpose? Is it meeting its goals? Is it actually making a profit, a surplus at the end of the year? Quickly into very management implementation activity. And to me, there needs to be clarity. That's the first thing. And then there does need to be like a professionalism around the nature of the board, so that they make time on their agendas for the strategic issues and the high-level financial issues, not into the sort of nitty-gritty of how they've managed their ILR that week, even though it might be still important.
And this is something that your code of good governance will help with.
Yes, I mean, again, when we started this piece of work, we we didn't know we would end up with a draft and now a code of good practice in the sector. However, when you observe what other sectors do, not just the college sector or the university sector, they've both got codes, but if you look in the sports industry, food industry, you will find that there's a code of good practice for governance. And what the code tries to do is draw out what we've seen as good practice, but also draw out which were weaknesses and how to address those weaknesses. And it brings together the best of the UK corporate code, the best of the charities code, but also is a hybrid because it brings in teaching and learning, which the other two codes do not.
And that's interesting, because one of the important areas of the board's responsibility, and which you highlight in the report, is to ensure the quality of the product, to ensure the quality of learning, teaching, and the curriculum. And it's often an area that board members, not just I think in this sector, but in others as well in education, feel a slight discomfort with, because usually they're coming from an area of law or finance or HR, and this is an area that's not so familiar with them, and so how to engage in ensuring the quality of the product is something that they might feel a bit uncomfortable about. And I was wondering, of the boards that you observed and the ones that impressed you, how are they tackling ensuring quality?
In a way, it's the reverse from these boards, because they've got the directors of the company who are often people who are the curriculum managers. They are not short of people around the table who know the ins and outs of the sort of what a good apprenticeship program looks like. However, what they don't have around the table is that independent voice. So they haven't got the financial expert who is independent of that company, or they haven't got the quality expert who may have been an ex-HMI who can question the managers around the table about what they are saying on learner satisfaction or learner progression or that type of thing. So it's an interesting mix where on a college board or on a university board, you're absolutely right. You've got all these external people who are fantastic in their day jobs, but know very little about the academic nature of a university, say, and are not that confident of going forward and asking those pressing questions. In the independent sector, I would say what they really need to make sure is that they've got an independent person sitting around the board who can ask those very challenging questions of the chief exec and the other directors around the table.
And in the independent sector, where you've seen that work, are those independent people members of the board, brought in especially with that portfolio, if you like?
Absolutely, that to me is the best model, that they're not shareholders, they haven't got a vested interest, they've been brought in, maybe paid, but they've been brought in to offer assurance to the chair and other shareholders that the chief exec is being challenged in an appropriate manner, and it will give them more confidence.
Earlier on you talked about that there should be no shame in making a profit, and when we were talking about the distinctive nature of this sector. To what extent do you think there's a perceived conflict that's inherent in the model of governance for this sector, in that you've got to reconcile meeting educational objectives, acting in the interests of trainees, and making a profit?
Yeah, well, we now procure much of our services, in the public sector, and when an organisation, whether it's somebody putting, the tarmac on the road or whatever, they cannot do it out of the sort of goodness of their hearts. Yeah, they do have to run a company, and they do have to have money for investment, and it's the same in the independent training providers. They, like a college, need to make sure at the end of the day they've got some money left to pay for their shareholders a dividend and reimburse into the company. That's how they go forward. And as government has chosen this model, and they've chosen to react and tender for this work, they should be more confident in that. However, there's profit and profit. Right? And what the taxpayer worries about is that profit is too large. and that the money that they were given doesn't actually go on the quality of the apprentices' experience. And that is where the tension lies. But the boards I've seen, work with integrity, they work with openness, and they're transparent. So I think there's such good practice there that people can be very confident in mirroring that good practice.
Well, I think we might be ready to see what our viewers have come up with in terms of questions that they'd like to ask. I know that you've developed a draft code of good governance as a result of this work. And I'm wondering, how important do you think it is for the sector to actually have a code, and what difference will it make?
Well, I mean, codes by themselves only are part of the answer. I think what this code does, because it's been developed by the sector, I might have done the drafting, I and my colleagues might have done the drafting, but it is learning providers who have actually contributed to this. And what this code will actually do is set a benchmark of what they need to work to and how they can go about doing it. But it needs to be underpinned, it needs to be underpinned by professional development in certain areas. I think there is something whereby chairs could have some staff development so that they could understand how to manage the difference between governance and management. I also think that the code itself has got 7 themes, and each of those themes are it's quite standalone, and there does need to be further underpinning guidance, systems advice for each one of those themes. But the code, as it's done in other sectors, should bring about assurance for the taxpayer, assurance for government, but more importantly, it should help to make sure that the learner, the apprentice, the employer are more assured that they're going to get a quality deal.
And I mean, it seems to me from reading the report, what you're saying is that even though this is a diverse sector, it is possible to have some consistency around governance. And I just wonder whether it would be worth your while saying what those 7 themes were that you've developed, that have come out of the report and that you've used in the code.
So the first theme is strategy and leadership, because the main role of the board is to make sure that the company is sustainable, that is financially secure, and that it's meeting the objectives of the limited company or the charity it's set up to be. So strategy and leadership, and actually making sure the vision is implemented, is really important. The next one is about corporate structures, and this is where the clarity comes between the sort of governance board, the chief exec and the directors and the operation. Incredibly important to have those underpinning structures, because when you're dealing with big sums of money, you do need to be very professional, and you do need to be formalising the structures underneath. And what's important in that aspect is delegation. Not everything needs to come to the board. Things can be delegated, and that clarity within the organisation is incredibly important. But that's like, those two are like common to a college, common to an adult community learning providers. Maybe the legal structure sitting underneath is different, but having clarity between governance and management, having clear leadership is important to every sector. But then when also we get into financial strategy and audit, now this is an incredibly important feature of providers continuing to get public funds, and they have to get it right. And they have to get it right in the context of what a good learner experience is. And that's sometimes the hardest bit, to get the right data on the board table with the right people asking the right questions at the right time. And what makes this code different than the UK corporate code? There's a whole theme about teaching and learning and outcomes for learners, because that is the prime purpose of the company. And if they don't get that right, they will not get continued funding from the funding agencies. So for the company itself, that is, for governance, is the prime sole nearly activity that they should be reviewing and looking at. And another sort of new area is really formalising the equality, diversity and safeguarding. So most independent providers are absolutely fantastic on safeguarding. They understand about making sure that people are, you know, safe in their industry, because they're often working in very practical situations which are quite dangerous. However, formalising it all, you know, looking at diversity is not new, but, you know, getting boards to look at, you know, have they got enough girls on that particular subject area? All that is sort of needs to be more formalised. And of course, because they're dealing with young people and adults, and some of these are vulnerable, you know, there's a whole prevent agenda that they have to take on board in the governance terms. And then they need transparency. They are dealing with public funds in the majority, and therefore their websites need to be clear. There needs to be ways that people can complain. They need to show how that public funds is being well spent. And then themselves, they need to be effective at governance. They need to be good at it. And when you're good at it, you feel more assured, you sleep at night, you can demonstrate your worth to funding agencies, you know, and you can make sure that your learners have got and apprentices have the best experience possible. And normally, if you do governance effective, you don't have to spend so much time at it. So there is a bonus in there for the actual board member.
So those are your 7 principles. We've got a question from John Brown in Orchard Hill. Why do you think we see so many disappointing inspection grades for independent training providers in the London region?
Very specific question. And when you look at the overall Ofsted grades, I mean, independent training providers are around the same as colleges. I haven't looked at London stats, but I would say, you know, often, and I can't be specific to London, but when you do look at weaknesses, is weaknesses about challenge of data. There's weaknesses about actually, you know, making sure that your trainee or apprentice has a clear progression route. There's weaknesses about, you know, lack of progression and aspiration for your learners. And in the report, we've got sort of 6 bullets, which those cover for areas for development. I would guess that London providers are no different, that they will have those similar weaknesses as the weaknesses we've observed out of London.
I mean, I'm just thinking, I suppose I'm pushing a little bit on the why is it coming up in the London region of providers. You're saying that you think it's not different from elsewhere.
I'm thinking that the weaknesses would be similar in London to the rest of the country on governance. I mean, there are other issues also to do with, you know, in London we don't have as many apprentices. There's a whole series of interlinking issues in London that we need to work on well. And also we've got, you know, very good, you know, GCSE results in the London region. Maybe you know, we've got a client group that needs more support. Maybe we're not recognising the different needs that we need to do in the London region.
I suppose the implication in the question, though, might be, is this something to do with governance?
Well, if you're getting poor inspection grades, I would say you've got poor governance as well, because the idea of having, you know, board members is that they actually get to the issue before the inspectors get to the issue. And if they've missed it, then that one goes to the other, that, you know, the governance side of it is weaker than it should be.
Okay. We've got another question from Richard Marsh, who asks, who says, we've created an external assurance board at Kaplan Financial based upon this guidance. As it can be quite hard to get appropriate learner representation, do you think there's a role for the NUS or apprenticeship ambassadors to make themselves available for this role?
Absolutely, and I would see that as good practice. And the NUS has now an apprenticeship branch. You know, they're working hard to make apprentices clear that they can be NUS members, and I think but this is an area that we need to do further work on. If you think of schools now, they start with, you know, 11-year-olds going to a school and you get a school council. Right? So the first thing you're saying to your sort of year 7s, do you want to be on the school council? So in the school sector, we're bringing up the learner voice. The time they get to the 6th form, they're quite vocal.
Yes.
Right? College sector, we're often building on those people so they become course reps. We now need the exact same structures in the apprenticeship world. And I also think there's something to do with, you know, many apprentices are in small companies. There's no reason why those apprentices cannot be brought together at the beginning of a sort of academic year as an induction, so they get to know each other. They should have their own social media set up. They should have their own Facebook pages. There should be ways that even though they disperse, that they can actually feed into the provider. And the role for the apprenticeship ambassadors, I think, is absolutely spot on. Perfect. He answered his own question. Absolutely perfect.
Yes. Yeah. So something maybe for others to think about too. Another question from someone who doesn't give their name. Colleges frequently have business people as the chair of their boards. I understand that it's rare for business boards to have an educationalist as a chair. Why do you think this is? Is there a loss in this? And, for example, a focus on learning could be lost.
That's quite an interesting question. I think it comes with a bit of perceived bias, right? Because out of the 6 boards that we observed, I would say at least 2, if not 3, had an educationalist as a chair. So somebody who would come from the sector, originally built up their own company and knew the education content very well. I would think what they were missing is the independence to challenge on the finances, on the audit, on the data. But if a board, a board will always have the directors of the company there who are having day-to-day hands-on experience with learners. So boards are not often going to be without the expertise needed to be able to explain a good learner experience. What's more, but there needs to be chairs of those boards who, if they haven't got that background, are willing to learn about that background, and that goes for a university or a college. It's not, independent chairs who come in and say, well, I've got financial banking experience and the rest of it. If they're going to become a chair of a college or university, they really do need to learn about what makes a good academic institution. And it's the same for independent training providers. They need a chair that totally understands what are the key performance indicators in that sector, whatever their background. And their commitment to learners is, to me, always the most important feature.
And I'm thinking it goes back to that question earlier on about reconciling the objectives of meeting the educational objectives, really understanding that, acting in the interest of trainees and running a business or making a profit. The next question that we've got, again from someone who hasn't given their name, is what is your own experience of board membership?
My own experience of board membership.
Yes. You can interpret that whichever way you like.
Well, on the train here today, I was thinking, gosh, when did I first join a board? And if you put aside the sort of sports committees I belonged to in my youth, right, it's now 31 years since I first joined a board. Yes. So my experience is broad, everything from the independent sector to I've been, I've done due diligence on FTSEs, the whole experience. Where do I feel most comfortable? Probably in the, I chaired, but I prefer vice chairing, or I prefer chairing of a committee. Further education, school governor, I'm a school governor and a university board member at this moment of time.
And maybe a rider to that question. From your experience of board membership, what is good governance? How do you recognise it? What do you see?
Yeah, when I go into a board, when I join a new board, I do like a bit of procedure. So I do like I've had to make sure that I've had to apply. I do like the fact that I've had to write a letter of application to say I want to be on that board. What is the specifics about that particular organisation I want to be part of? Then when you go onto the board, I'd like to see that you've got an induction. It's really important that you've been inducted. I'd like to make sure that I've got access to the senior staff, that I'm not being kept away from things. Not that as a board member you want to sort of drill down daily, but you do need to feel that if you've got an issue that you can take it up with the sort of right people. And then when you get to the board, the paperwork is like prime to have if you want to be have real impact on the board, you cannot be the police person, you cannot be the detective, you cannot be given, 100 pages and expected to find out, what are the things that are going wrong. You shouldn't have to do your own research. There should be like exemption reports on the front. So there's a bit about process, but then there's also a bit about board dynamics. It's no good going into a board where everybody is not sharing the same values, where people are there for their own interests, where the chair can't make the board experience inclusive. So there's several factors in there which make a good board meeting. And most board members, many are being paid in the private sector, but in the public sector, you're an unpaid volunteer. And therefore, you do need to feel that you have had some value about sitting there, that the executive values you, and the fact that you've had some impact.
Mm. And I'm thinking that touches on one of the principles that you talked about earlier in the code about transparency.
Absolutely.
And also having systems and processes that are clear.
Yep.
So that people know what they're doing and can be accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. And you shouldn't, as a board member, be expected to be like the executive. You would expect your executive to be open and transparent, and if they've got an issue, they bring it to the board. I think your worst experience as a board member is that you've dug through, like I say, 100 pages of normally data, to find progression rates are dropping. You're finding that the cost per student is going up, and there's no recollection, nobody's recognising that if they don't do something soon, they will be bankrupt. And that is when, it's not a good experience being a board member.
Mm. Okay. We've got another question from Susie Simon Norris from Somerset Skills and Learning. And she says, we're a community interest company with voluntary independent board members. We've been fortunate in attracting people who know the sector, but have had difficulty attracting directors with other skills, such as finance and audit. Did your research identify recruitment difficulties for board members, and do you have any solutions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a common theme, across all sectors at this moment, that there is not enough volunteers out there with the right expertise. ETF offers a service to help you find board members. So with Susie, I'll be happy to put her in contact with the right people to do that. And there are some other agencies in that role of doing matching people. You do have to work a bit harder, but if you advertise in the right places, then I'm pretty confident you will be able to find the right people.
Mm-hmm. We've got another question from someone who doesn't give their name. Lord Nolan's principles of public life guides us all well. Which one of these do you think is of most value to independent providers? That's a good question.
It's a very good question. I think some people find this the 7 underpinning principles a bit difficult. Mainly things like the selflessness one, right? It's hard when you're in the private sector to think, well, how can I be, selflessness? But what you've got to think about is that you've been given a contract by government to do a particular job. You have been picked to do that. And you can, show self-worth by actually demonstrating that you're open and transparent and lots of the other Nolan principles. And it's within, needs to be a balance there. If you've got public funds, you have to demonstrate that you're using those public funds in an appropriate manner. And that's the key to all of it. The other one is this thing about transparency, or openness, as Nolan would have called it. That's incredibly important, but there are some business interests that you don't want to share with everybody, especially if you're bidding for new work. And of course, that's fine, because you do it within the structure that you're working in at that time. And that's what when you think of the Nolan principles, you have to be, it's proportionate and a sort of the reasonable test, right? Are we being reasonable? Are we using public funds in the right way? And that's therefore they've all got their tensions, but they're all applicable.
Mm. And it's an openness within the board as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And not having closed groups where conversations happen, but they don't happen for
Yeah.
the board as a
Yeah.
whole.
Yeah, and you touch on another, interesting thing about good boards. Good boards are about openness. Good boards is not when three, the two chairs, the two sub-chairs and the chair go away and decide everything, or they do it down the pub. That's not openness. Openness is when, there is a collective working for the best of that company.
Okay. Another question. You've been a member of different boards, colleges, universities, charities. Can you name a quality from each one that's impressed you?
Oh, from each one?
Yes, boards, colleges, universities, charities.
Well, I can say similarity, which is the easiest, right? In all those boards, is where I'm most impressed is when people come in, often know very little about, academic life, know very little about what makes a good learning experience, and within 6 months they understand totally. They are there to support, the trainee, the apprentice, the undergraduate, or the FE student, and that's the thing that really impresses me. The difference, they are all culturally different. You can't, there will be the university board that looks a bit like an FE board and an FE board that looks like a university board, but there is a sort of difference. However, good governance, if you look at all the codes now for all three of them, it brings together, the thing about integrity, the working in openness, the thing about putting the student at the centre of all your work. So that I would say there's more similarities than differences.
I was thinking one of the things that impresses me when I see it is when members of a board have a clear understanding of what their role is. They know they're a non-executive, and that's different from being an executive, and that they're able to challenge and support the executive and to really be a critical friend. The nature of the questioning, which gives rise to maybe a conversation that wouldn't happen otherwise.
Yeah, and I think, again, you're absolutely right there. The role of the critical friend, and when to challenge and when to support is what makes a good board member. Or, as a board, you work out your roles. So I'm on a board whereby I know I don't need to challenge on that particular item because I know this board member is, but I'm the supporter in that particular item. So you can work out your roles, but once you've made a decision, then it is about collective responsibility. And that's also what makes a good board, is that they are collectively responsible and they stick to the decision that has been made. Okay,
and another question. Board appraisals. Are independent providers boards stricter on this than other FE boards?
Some are, some are not. But if you have a paid chair, they normally will have a 180 degrees or 360 degrees appraisal. They will have, the other board members will have appraisals as well. But then again, in the FE sector and the universities, that has become common practice. And it isn't a difference between other sectors, it's more a difference about, whether people take it seriously or not. And that is probably of a similar ilk in all three sectors.
So just tell us a bit about the code of conduct that is emerging from this piece of work as well, Sue. You're doing it with ALP.
Yep. Okay, so a code is a code of good governance, and it's about underpinning principles, but it's also about values. And the concept is to make sure that we have, going through the sector, the independent training provider sector, that they share a set of values. The values are then underpinned, as we've already said, about the Nolan principles, and then we've got our 7 themes, which are, I've spoken about. And the idea with the code is that this begins to become a benchmark that people adopt. It's not as yet part of any financial agreement with the funding agencies, where for the college code it is. Therefore, it is for independent providers to take this, to look at what they're doing now, to evaluate it, to see where they actually meet it. And going forward, we expect the code to be that benchmark. We expect in 3 years' time it will be reviewed to sort of nearly again up the game again. And it's a voluntary code, and to me that's when codes are best, is when sectors adopt something where they set the benchmark of good governance themselves and allow themselves to be in the lead. And
I mean, it seems to me that this is an extensive piece of work that you've done. It's robust. You've looked at all the codes of governance that are out there right across sectors, and you've distilled it in this report. You give a good snapshot, I think, of the sector too. It gives us a good idea of what's going on, and you've produced this code as well. What would you like to happen next?
Well, I'd like, for providers to adopt it. I'd like them to work to the principles that are there. I'd like the sort of development agents that we have in the FE world to underpin it and support continuous professional development. But more importantly, what I'd like to see in sort of 3 years' time is this perceived idea that governance isn't as strong in the independent sector is squashed. Right, that we can see that they have as good as practice as any other sector, but also that learners are absolutely assured if they go into that particular learning provider that they are going to have a fantastic experience, and that fantastic experience is going to be down to, yes, the wonderful staff that we have in the independent sector and the teachers and assessors, but it's also going to the executive, but it's also going to be down to good governance, because the governance board has determined that that learner, that apprentice, that trainee is really going to get a fantastic experience in that organisation.
So this is really something that can go towards giving assurance about the quality
Absolutely.
of the provision of teaching and learning for the trainee, the quality of apprenticeships as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't have really good quality without a good underpinning financial systems, and you can't have really good financial systems without good governance, and the three go together. And if we got our boards checking on progression and making sure that that the trainees' experience is first class, then we're going to be in a better position to going forward.
And it seems that this is a really significant part of leadership in the sector too, not just this sector but all sectors, in terms of taking governance seriously and really developing it.
And that's why I think ALP has to be applauded. They are the leaders and influencers of their sector, and they've gone about getting it on the front foot and doing this as a major project for themselves and putting a lot of time and energy into it. And it is about leadership. It's about leadership of the sector. It's like people with influence deciding that they want to move the sector forward. And it's also about people who are chief execs and board chairs of independent providers wanting to help the sector get on. And there is a vested interest in there because it'll help to improve reputation, but also, as you're saying, the bottom line is that we will be assured that that investment is going to make sure that the apprenticeship's journey is first class.
Well, thank you, Sue, for that very interesting discussion on what you found in the report. I'd like to say thank you to the audience too, who've tuned in. Keep sending in your questions because they will be answered. There is a full PDF copy of the report on the website, and you can download it. What we hope is that you will share it with your colleagues and that you will share it with members of your boards if you're on a board, and that whilst you're there on the FETL website you'll also take a look at some of the other free resources that are there, because they are very helpful and stimulating, I think, in terms of just generating more discussions about good practice in the sector. So thank you very much.